My father kicked me out, mocking me as a failure who would never make a dime. 7 years later, I walked into his private luxury dinner, quiet and composed. When he tried to humiliate me again, his top partner stood up to reveal the truth. I am now a billionaire. My name is Maria Camila, 33 years old. I stood at the edge of the opulent dining room, my heart beating in a steady, controlled rhythm that felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. The air in this New York penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and cold, calculating ambition. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his booming voice cutting through the soft jazz music like a serrated blade. He was surrounded by sycophants and high-level investors, all hanging on his every word. He looked older, his hair thinner, but the cruelty in his eyes remained as sharp as it was 7 years ago. He was regaling his guests with yet another story about his supposed genius, oblivious to the fact that his greatest failure was standing just a few feet away. I adjusted the strap of my simple, modest dress, feeling the weight of the phone in my pocket. This was not the night for grand gestures or dramatic entrances. It was the night for a very quiet, very permanent shift in power. The room was bright, but I felt like a shadow waiting to consume everything. Every clinking glass and forced laugh felt like a mocking echo of the day. He kicked me out, telling me I would never be anything without his name or his money. Well, he was right about one thing. I became everything. But I certainly didn't need his help to do it. The game was about to change forever. I walked forward, my heels silent against the plush velvet carpet that had been laid out for the evening's elite gathering. The atmosphere was stifling, filled with men who measured human worth by profit margins and quarterly earnings. My father noticed movement and squinted his eyes, his gaze landing on me with a flicker of annoyance, clearly wondering why an uninvited guest dared to intrude on his carefully curated reality. "We are in the middle of a private discussion," he barked, his face turning a shade of angry crimson that I remembered all too well from my childhood. He stood up, towering over his chair, clearly expecting me to wither under his famous glare. He did not recognize me at first. The woman he had cast aside was long gone, replaced by someone who had learned to navigate the shark-infested waters of high-stakes finance. I kept my expression blank, a calm mask that concealed the turbulent memories of the struggle I had endured to reach this peak of success. The other guests whispered, their eyes darting between my father's rage and my calm demeanor. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. He had spent years trying to erase me from his life. But tonight, he would be forced to acknowledge exactly what he had lost. The silence in the room stretched thin, brittle as glass, waiting for the inevitable moment of impact, when the truth would finally shatter the carefully maintained facade of his corporate empire. He sneered, a look of pure contempt flashing across his face as he gestured toward my modest attire with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Whatever you are selling, get out," he growled, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling, clearly eager to prove his dominance in front of his wealthy associates. He did not know that the woman standing before him controlled the very venture capital firm that held the majority of his company's debt. I watched him carefully, noting how he leaned on his ego like a crutch, never bothering to check his surroundings or consider the possibility that someone might be far more dangerous than he was. My father lived in a world where he was the biggest fish, and he could not fathom a reality where I had swam past him into deeper, more treacherous waters. I felt a strange sense of pity for him. His life was a hollow shell, built on the shifting sands of arrogance and debt. The irony was almost too much to handle. But I kept my face stone-faced, my pulse steady as I prepared to reveal the truth that would send his world crashing down. I had spent years building a foundation of steel, while he had been busy polishing a throne of rotting wood. The guests were beginning to shift in their seats, sensing that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. But they were too terrified of my father to intervene or speak a word. He laughed then, a sharp barking sound that grated on my nerves like metal on stone. He looked at the wine glass in his hand, then back at me, his eyes mocking. "Look at her," he announced to the room, gesturing at me as if I were some pathetic street beggar. "She probably thinks she can ask for a handout. Or maybe she wants a loan because her life fell apart." He chuckled, turning back to his guests to solicit their laughter, expecting them to join in his cruel performance. "She always thought she was special, but look at that dress. That is a discount rack special, isn't it? You will never make a dime in this world. Maria, you are a failure, just like you were the day I told you to leave." The room erupted in polite, nervous titters, the kind of laughter that comes from people terrified of the man with the checkbook. I stood still, letting his words wash over me like dirty water. They didn't sting anymore. In fact, they only sharpened my resolve. I looked at the way he held his shoulders, arrogant, proud, and completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing on a trap door I had spent years building just for this exact moment. He thought he was the master of the universe, but he was actually a man who had built his own cage. I waited for the laughter to die down, my eyes fixed intently on my father's flushed face. His confidence was a physical thing, radiating from him like heat from a furnace, fueled by the blind belief that his status made him untouchable. He took a sip of his wine, looking smug as he waited for me to leave, his patience for this unwanted interruption clearly nearing its absolute end. The room felt incredibly small suddenly, the air vibrating with an unspoken tension that made the other guests lean forward, their curiosity finally beginning to outweigh their fear. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, sleek tablet, my fingers dancing across the screen for a brief second to finalize the data transmission. I was not here for a confrontation or a dramatic outburst. I was here for a calculated professional maneuver that would change his legacy forever. My father didn't notice the gesture, too busy adjusting his silk tie and turning his back to me to consult with a nearby associate. He was already planning his next remark, unaware that the ground beneath his expensive designer shoes was about to collapse. I realized then that justice wasn't always a roaring fire. Sometimes it was a quiet, cold calculation that moved with the precision of a clock. I felt a surge of strength, the kind that comes from knowing you are in complete control of your own destiny. And I braced myself for the final act of this long, exhausting and transformative journey. My father turned back, his expression darkening as he realized I hadn't moved an inch from my spot. The irritation in his eyes was palpable, a mix of genuine confusion and wounded pride that I dared to ignore his direct command to leave. He started to walk toward me, his heavy footsteps echoing across the polished hardwood floor, intent on physically intimidating me into submission just as he had done when I was just a child. But this time I did not shrink away. I stood my ground, my posture firm and unwavering. The other guests went completely silent now, the air in the room turning heavy with anticipation as they realized this was no longer a simple family dispute, but a power struggle they were witnessing firsthand. My father reached me, his voice a low, dangerous hiss meant only for my ears. I said, "Leave. Maria, do not make me call security. And have you dragged out of here? In front of these people. You have absolutely nothing to your name, and you are wasting my time with this pathetic display of desperation." He leaned in closer, his face twisted in a mask of pure arrogance, still fully convinced that I was the same broken, penniless girl he had cast aside 7 years ago. He had no idea that I had spent every single day since that moment planning for this exact confrontation, using his own lessons in cold, hard ambition against him. I looked him square in the eye, my gaze steady and devoid of the fear he had spent my entire upbringing trying to cultivate. His assumption of my poverty was not just an insult. It was his greatest strategic error, While he had been busy inflating his own ego, I had been diligently acquiring assets, quietly buying out the debts that kept his company afloat, and waiting for the market to shift in my favor. I saw his smug smile start to waver, a tiny crack in his armor that revealed the first glimmer of genuine concern beneath the surface. He wasn't used to being met with silence, and he certainly wasn't used to being ignored when he issued a threat. I didn't say a word, allowing the weight of the silence to press down on him, turning the tables in a way that left him visibly disoriented. He pulled back slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to figure out why I wasn't shaking. The room was deathly quiet now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, sensing that the dynamic of the night had fundamentally tilted. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me, the realization that his power was a fragile, hollow construct that I could dismantle with a single move. He reached for his glass again, his hand trembling just enough to make the liquid ripple, an involuntary tell that his carefully rehearsed control was finally starting to slip away. The tension in the room grew so intense that it felt as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the penthouse. Just as my father opened his mouth to escalate his verbal assault, a chair scraped loudly against the floor behind him. A tall, impeccably dressed man, his top bank partner, stood up, his face uncharacteristically pale as he stared at his phone and then directly at me. My father frowned, turning around with a sharp, impatient movement, clearly annoyed by the interruption of his moment of cruelty. "Not now, Richard," my father snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "We are handling a personal matter." But the man didn't sit down. Instead, he walked toward us, ignoring my father entirely, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of profound shock and begrudging respect. The rest of the investors exchanged confused glances, the atmosphere shifting from one of mockery to one of genuine nervous curiosity. I didn't look at my father. I kept my focus on the banker, who was holding a document that would soon become the most important piece of paper in this man's life. The silence was absolute, a void waiting to be filled with the truth that had been hidden for far too long. The banker reached the center of the room, his movements stiff and formal, as if he were approaching royalty rather than the daughter my father had publicly labeled a failure. My father let out a confused, indignant laugh, clearly expecting the man to back him up and order me out. Instead, the partner stopped directly in front of me and offered a shallow, respectful bow that sent a ripple of absolute disbelief through the gathered crowd. My father's jaw literally dropped, his face paling as he tried to reconcile the reality of his partner's behavior with the narrative he had just spun. The banker didn't look at my father. He kept his eyes on me, his expression guarded but clearly humbled by the sheer scale of what was happening. It was the kind of moment that people would whisper about in boardrooms. For years to come, a total, irreversible shift in the hierarchy of the local financial scene. My father looked back and forth between us, his hands balling into fists at his sides, his breathing becoming ragged and uneven. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was no longer the most important person in his own house. The power had moved, flowing silently away from him and settling firmly on the person he had most cruelly tried to destroy. The realization seemed to hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him stumbling back a step. The banker cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. He held the document out, but not to my father. He held it toward me with both hands, his gesture signaling complete submission. "Correction," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound, shaky authority that made the other investors flinch in their seats. "My apologies for the confusion earlier, but MS Grace has just officially hit billionaire status. The acquisition is finalized." The word hung in the air, heavy and transformative, turning the room into a graveyard of shattered reputations. My father's face drained of every drop of color, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. as he looked at the man he trusted most in the world. The banker turned to him, his expression cold and professional, effectively stripping my father of his pride in a single brutal sentence. The reality of the situation began to set in for everyone present. The woman who had been mocked as a pauper a mere 5 minutes ago was now the one who held their financial futures in her palm. The absolute power my father had clung to for so long had evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of his own hubris and the undeniable success of the daughter he had tried to erase. The air felt charged, electric with the sudden, undeniable shift in fortune that had left my father trembling in the middle of his own private kingdom, utterly exposed and defeated. I stepped into the center of the sudden void, feeling the cool, polished floor beneath my heels. My father looked like a man who had lost his moorings in a violent storm, his gaze darting around the room, desperately seeking an ally who was no longer there. The silence was absolute. Nobody dared to speak, to cough, or even to shift their weight, fearing they might be caught in the fallout of this spectacular collapse. I allowed myself a small, thin smile, not one of triumph, but of profound, quiet justice. I looked at the table full of half-eaten luxury meals and realized how quickly prosperity could turn into dust when it was built upon a foundation of cruelty. My father opened his mouth to protest, perhaps to claim some lingering relevance, but no sound escaped his throat. He was a shell of a man, his arrogance stripped away to reveal the frightened, insecure individual underneath. I turned my attention to the other guests, seeing them recoil slightly as if my success were contagious, which in a way it was. I had survived the darkest parts of his abandonment, and in the process, I had forged a strength that he could never hope to understand. I watched his eyes track my movements, seeing the dawning horror as he finally understood that his reign was over, and it was entirely his own actions that had led him to this miserable public end. I stood tall, the weight of 7 years of struggle finally lifting from my shoulders, replaced by the cool, hard reality of absolute control. My father stood frozen, his empire crumbling into nothingness beneath the weight of his own arrogance. He had tried to crush me, to render me invisible, but he had only forged a weapon that would ultimately dismantle his entire life. As I walked toward the exit, the room fell into a terrified, reverent hush, the hierarchy of power permanently inverted. I had reclaimed my name, my worth, and my future, proving that true strength is not given, but seized through sheer resilience and an unwavering belief in oneself. Justice was finally served, cold and complete, and I was leaving this house stronger than I ever dreamed possible. My journey of transformation was only just beginning, and the world was finally ready to see exactly what I could do. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, hit that button, turn on notifications, and join my journey to see how I transformed from a victim into a force of nature. Like and subscribe for more tales of survival and ultimate revenge.